All right, our next speaker is Helen Millicer. She's from One Planet Consulting, and she'll be talking about what major changes are required for plastics. Helen was one of the first in Australia to explore and work on Australia's transition to a more circular economy. Helen is well placed for this perspective, given her decades working nationally in all sustainability disciplines of energy, carbon, water, organics, and material, industry and manufacturing. Please welcome Helen.
Hello everyone, I'm absolutely delighted to be here and meet with you. I have a few items to, disclose. I was previously on the board advisor to Replayers, so for 2 years, I'm not sure if the company's not here, Replayers, who do a fair amount of bulk product made out of recycled material, predominantly soft plastics, the sort that we just saw, and post-consumer soft plastics as well. Anyway, I'll go on to a little bit more in a moment. But yeah, really wonderful to be here. Quick question for you, if I may. So who has plans for super and their retirement in the next 10 years? Put up your hand. Only 3? Surely, if you're more than 3 people, fantastic, okay. So, and how many people have plans to expand or revamp their business in the next 10 years? A couple more hands go up, good, okay. And how many people saw and had planned for a pandemic? Okay, so how many people have planned for the impacts of climate change with your business? A couple of hands going up, okay. Okay, in terms of severe weather, disruption to your supply chains? Any hands going up? Has anyone been impacted by disruption to your supply chain in the last 2 years? Okay. All right, so we know what it's like, and it's only going to get worse because of climate change. So it's really important that we think about supply chains in the future because it does make a difference. So it's a reality we have to address. So a little bit about myself. That was a really brief introduction. So I am currently working on a major project for the Australian government on product design for circularity. Perhaps I'll start at the end. So my background and experience, for 5 years I worked at Pacia, which is now Chemistry Australia, as the National Sustainability Manager, and worked on energy, water, materials, carbon and financial profitability of businesses ranging from Dow right through to New Farm, right through to a number of major plastics manufacturers, and Qenos, worked closely with them. And then I went to work for the Vinyl Council of Australia and had a stint for a while in the Victorian government, working on the New Energy Jobs Fund program, curbside reform, the $55 million grant program, and of course the ubiquitous plastic bag ban here in Victoria, which we ensured included all types of plastics, including compostables. So the intent was to shift public and consumer and retail behaviour away from unnecessary plastics. So I know very well the issue that we have in terms of moving away from unnecessary, what are termed unnecessary problematic plastics. I then went to work for 2 years with APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, on everything from recycled content guide, which included plastics as well as cardboard and fibre, their LCA guide, packaging future strategy, and plastics export specifications, which became instrumental to the Australian government's waste plastics specifications, which now stipulate that if you're going to be sending plastics overseas, it needs to be 95 to 90%, 99% single polymer processed clean. Some of the other things I'm working on. So back to the top again. So that has enabled me to now work for the Australian government, the Australian Food and Grocery Council on stewardship program for soft plastics, post-consumer, and also the 22 conference program for the Society of Plastics Engineers, which will be on in November. So that's a bit of my background. And so from that, I guess bringing fresh eyes to manufacturing and the whole of sustainability. I did a Churchill Scholarship in 2018, and some of what I'm presenting to you today comes from what I observed, what was going on in Europe and Southeast Asia back then and continues to go on today. So this is one planet, predominantly a water planet, an ocean planet, and we're there in the middle, and it's Australia. It's a Goldilocks planet, and as everyone knows, we are in the middle of an extraordinary transformation of this planet as a result of human engineering. What do we have to do about it? We have to change some of the fundamentals. And that's us individually, in our businesses, and collectively as well, and that's why I'm delighted to be here to speak to ARMA. So is this a waste or a resource? I see this as a resource. This isn't waste. This is actually source-separated polymer. Yes, it's piled up, but it's been collected in Europe at transfer stations. They don't throw their durable plastics to landfill. Yes, it goes into facilities like this, but you can see the bunding at the back. This is actually about to all be reprocessed, and I'll talk about the company that does this at the end. But think about the embodied carbon within this, both the natural gas that's been used to make it, plus also all the energy that's been used to make it, all the effort and the materials and the people and the resources that have been used to make it. So, no more business as usual. What have we got coming up? Plastics and emissions are under strain in our licence to operate in our industry. So earlier this year, the UN Environment Assembly, 175 nations agreed to form binding targets by 2024 to end marine plastic pollution. All of these are live links, and the slides will be emailed to you, I gather, so you'll be able to click on the link and go to it if you like. So the Federal Minister, Tanya Plibersek, is off to further conversations about this. It ties into the federal government's commitment for biodiversity and protecting biodiversity. The EU Commission and Circular Plastics Alliance, which is an alliance of major associations like ARMA from across Europe, have banded together. They are targeting no less than 10 million tonnes per annum of recycled plastics back into product in the EU by 2025. And I've got a graph that will show you, I think they've met it already in 2022. That's an astonishing threefold increase of where they were in 2017. Phenomenal. And you can imagine the transformation that has resulted in their supply chains in order to recover that vast quantity. Plastic Europe is now this year calling for mandatory 30% recycled content in packaging. Can you imagine an industry association calling for mandatory recycled content? The reason they're doing that is because they want to close the loop. They're seeing material being exported. They want to preserve their own industry within their own nation, within their economic bloc, rather than seeing it going offshore. Because they're doing such a damn good job, they don't actually want their recycled material to be coming to countries like Australia. Because at the moment, if you're calling for recycled content, you're buying it from Europe in order to come into Australia. So we have the challenge of now competing against the Europeans for that material if they're going to be starting to specify for recycled content. So what are we doing about that? Following on from that, the EU Council earlier this year committed to a carbon border adjustment mechanism so that there will be a tax imposed on products that are made in countries that don't have a carbon price. They're serious about it. I could go on, but let's get on to some of these other things. Denmark Consumer Ombudsman is now requiring any environmental claims made by manufacturers and brand owners to have an LCA to back up the claim. Wonderful things that our councils and state governments and industry are doing, a growth in green public procurement, and there's a link there to see what the Hamburg state government there is doing. Of course, I've already mentioned the plastic waste ban. Australian and New Zealand governments have plastic pollution plans and bans in place, but that'll come into effect by 2025. The Victorian government has specified that all public service sectors from Department of Justice, which includes jails, and Department of Health, have to have a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emission target and plan by 2030. So that impacts what they're going to be purchasing, how they're going to be using it, what their waste will be generated. That is useful and informative for you. I could go on and on and on and on. Anyway, Why we have to act, I won't talk long about this, but we do have a code red crisis, and this is what is driving so much of the change. Why is it so? Because of fossil fuels and industry. The emissions, that extraordinary line that you see going up there, is because of what we've been doing and the lifestyle we've created, which is so energy intensive. So the fossil fuels and industry, which supports our industry, which is plastics, is not acceptable going forward. And this is why a circular system is fundamental going forward. So this is the consequences. These are just some photos from this year. We've got a cow on a roof from a flood in Lismore. We've got businesses that have been flooded out with extraordinary flooding. That business is no longer viable. We have wineries that can't grow their grapes, and we have massive bushfires. That's based on the emissions that we've created in the past. Who knows what the future is going to be? So for those of you that aren't aware, the Kyoto Protocol, which we finally signed in 2007, which was established last century, specifies these are the greenhouse gas emission factors for the different sources. So there's methane, which is a result of natural gas, which is one of the reasons why natural gas is so much in the firing line now, because it is a short-term but high emission factor gas. Nitrous oxide, which comes, so if you have high water output from your treatment facilities, that's going into wastewater treatment, that has a factor of 265 in terms of the carbon dioxide equivalent. So you see how important it is that each individually we are more efficient with our production processes, but collectively we also work together to change that. So we're on a race to 2030. For all of those of you that know that we are now on a path to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% within the next 7.5 years. That's basically a 7.5% cut per annum. If you can achieve that, that'll be absolutely brilliant. And particularly in energy intensive industries, the scrutiny and the attention upon us is going to only grow. The emission intensity of plastics is not as great as obviously steel, cement or aluminium, but nevertheless, this is already from 2018, 4 years ago. It was produced when I was overseas by a fabulous firm called Material Economics. And they have looked at what are the emissions intensity of different production processes and plastics. And what is fascinating, that for 1 tonne of virgin plastic made into product, they're saying there's basically 5 tonne of greenhouse gas emissions arising from that through the whole supply chain. However, if you have renewable energy, it comes down fractionally to 3.7. So when we were at Replas, we were looking at extending the renewable energy solar panels on the system, on the roof, but that's still not enough. The most effective thing we can do is mechanical recycling of the plastics. Putting it back into product again, as Vision Plastics showed us, that brings you down to less than 1. So let's close the loop on our plastics. Chemical recycling is slightly more, 1 for 1. All right, system changes really quickly. We're currently in a linear economy pretty much. We have some recycling, but not much. I'm not sure how much of you are taking back product from anywhere to put back into your product, but that would be an ideal system to move to a circular economy where we take, make, use. It doesn't end up in the rubbish bin. It goes back into reuse, like those bulk bags or even silo systems. We have recycling and return. That's what we want to get to. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation provides this magnificent diagram. I won't go into that because we haven't got time. But really, this is what the Europeans, as a result of their various strategic initiatives, have been achieving. So you can see that from 2006, they have been gradually increasing both their incineration of plastics, which is predominantly packaging, but they've been also significantly increasing their recycling rate, while their waste to landfill in plastics, and this is not just packaging, this is all plastics. So you think about flooring, you think about the kind of product you're producing, substantial decrease in material to landfill. And in fact, you can see the uptick in here This is since they've been really ratcheting up their policies and programs at a significant level. They've already reached their 10 million tonne. Now, isn't that an astonishing achievement? And that has come through collaboration and cooperation between governments, industry groups such as ARMA and others, and in businesses to achieve that extraordinary result. So even with the war in Ukraine and the astronomical challenges they're facing with gas, at least that's going to accelerate that, if nothing else will. By comparison, here in Australia, this is an annual report which is produced, and I hope this is familiar to you. You can see that our recovery rate, which is the green line, has remained pretty static in Australia. Meanwhile, our consumption has arisen, and our waste to landfill has arisen. This is an absence of policy, this is an absence of strategy, this is a thinking of business as usual. It's not enough anymore going forward. So what do we do about it? This is a graph. This is showing you what your particular polymer application may be. So for LDPE, a tiny fraction of which is locally processed and recycled into local use. Now, if we go back to what they're doing in Europe, you can see how the graph is so vastly different. They recognise that their polymers are an incredible resource and not waste. So this is some of the examples of what they've been doing, and I'll be really quick on this. So they understand their supply chain. They understand that for every point in their supply chain, there is an externality and an impact, right? To go to circular systems, to have a continuous license, social license to operate, they understand that there need to be changes in every way across that system. And I gave you examples of how they're now proposing a ban on recyclable materials to landfill. They have brought about a change to the cost of externalities. They're protecting their industry by bringing in a carbon adjustment mechanism in order to support those that are doing really well. They're bringing about collection changes, they're bringing about changes to end of life, they're bringing about changes to secondary material to get higher value quality material back into production again, and they're changing the market by having green procurement. Okay. They did an assessment of how they're actually performing. This is back in 2018, and I'm sure if they were to do this again now, it would be vastly different. They've identified where they were doing well and where they weren't doing particularly well. They've identified that in things like collection targets, yep, okay, they've done reasonably well on that. Regulation of additives, they've done reasonably well on that. But on things like public procurement and standardisation, it was partial. In things like producer responsibility, there was almost nothing. And the same you could say, to some extent, for Australia. Now, what I'm suggesting is that you are on the front foot and you take the opportunity to devise the system that is best for you going forward, right? This is my analysis of what we could be doing here in Australia, and to some extent that we're not. Taking on that same philosophy and approach around virgin material, producer responsibility, industry targets, demand pull, recycled content, new recycling systems, even to the extent that we call for an end to low-cost landfill in order that there is a greater business case for material to come back into the system again. So here's one manufacturer that I visited when I was in Europe, Van Verven. They have since expanded their facility. So when I was there, they had 5 plants. Now they're at 6 plants. They're already putting their throughput and output is 200,000 tonnes per annum. This is one business in Europe. What's extraordinary is they have 25 different polymers that they are creating and selling back into the European and overseas market. They achieve this because it's source separated at transfer stations. It comes to them by particular rigid type. They then do further sorting to get really top quality. They have some mechanical sorting, they've got robotics, but they have market pull and they have deals with customers to close the loop on material. So they have guaranteed customers who will commit to take recycled content. And it's backed up by state regulations and laws as well. So no more of the old ways, please. Let's from today make some kind of commitments that we're moving away from the old linear system where we had so much quality plastics going to landfill at the end of life, that we had inefficient heating, cooling systems in our workplaces. Let's move to these away from the linear systems, away from single-use plastics, high waste, minimal recycling, and no incentives or priorities where we actually prioritise high consumption instead of efficiency. Because that is where we're at with the status quo. What we want instead is emission cuts by 2050. Can you imagine how astonishing and wonderful it would be if the plastics industry was to say that they are leaders in Australasia in cutting emissions significantly? Clean energy, electrified systems, some gas going into product necessarily rather than necessarily burning it if that's possible to create heat. How can we move to more efficient and circular systems? There's a wealth of material and expertise from a number of other industry sectors that can be drawn on in terms of highly efficient production processes. Let's move to moving material around and recovering for it as much as possible and move to a more viable and sustainable future. So my suggestions for ARMA and for you are to pursue bold systemic change. Because whether we like it or not, it's coming. And whether the pressure is a high gas price here on the eastern seaboard or Australia, or public opinion pushing for a change, we can't continue with business as usual anymore. We also have to be ready for the impacts of climate change. We have to be ready for the sea level rise, we have to be ready for the worst storms, we have to be ready for the hot events, we have to be ready for looking after our staff and our supply chains to make sure that everyone in our supply chains can continue to support us in this journey for a low emissions circular future. So what is your recycled content plan? How do you get material back into your product stream? What are you doing in terms of negotiating with your suppliers for recycled content into your material? Do you need to change the way in which you're manufacturing in some way to incorporate recycled content within inner core and an outer skin? Are they some of the things that you need to do? Consider and watch what are these international trends, because they are coming. If you can't be exporting, if you can't, or you're going to be subject to these sorts of rules and regulations, it's better to be on the front foot. So design as you can for reuse, recovery, recyclability. Remove those additives that are going to inhibit you, such as carbon black or things like that. Design for repair and disassembly. Reorientate your supply chains. Pursue the training and certification. Bring on board people with those kinds of skills and capacity. Draw on people who can give you a life cycle assessment. I know that Qenos, who's here today, is doing a review of their recycle or their carbon footprint when they get their advanced chemical recycling facility built here in Melbourne. There's a lot of change going on in the industry, and push for the kinds of governmental policies, levies and incentives that you need and that will support you to do the right thing going forward. So here's that slide again, just as a reminder for you to see what's coming down the line. This is just what's in train now. Who knows what the next initiatives are going to be next year, here in Australia, in New Zealand or overseas, but it's certainly coming. So be leaders for the 21st century. I really look forward to working with you again going forward, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks. Sure. Life cycle assessment. So a life cycle assessment is a review of your product from cradle to grave, or cradle to cradle. So that would take into account your water, your energy, your carbon footprint, the litter that might arise from that particular product. It was been quite useful. I can remember working on a project with Orica where we looked at the carbon footprint of them recovering waste lube oil in order to put into their explosives, and they found that it was viable for them to do in remote regional Australia, so that was an initiative they took on, for example. So LCAs are used extensively, for example, with and should be used more. So when in packaging, for example, you know that there's been this push away from plastic packaging towards things like paper packaging. Actual fact, paper has a higher LCA footprint because you are chopping down trees in order to make something which has a single use. Whereas, for example, the work I'm doing with the Australian Food and Grocery Council, we know that soft plastic packaging has a lower LCA if, especially, we can get back into packaging again or product again. So LCAs are increasingly being asked for to prove the value and the environmental impact of your product. Okay. So I'll repeat the question. So the question was, given the changes that we're seeing in Europe, what's the kind of time frame and what's happening here in Australia? So if I go back to that slide, a number of these initiatives are already underway and they're certainly being looked at. So the federal government has a program to support stewardship schemes, a grant program to see the establishment of them. Funnily enough, or not funnily enough, the majority of them happen to relate to plastics. So Dairy Australia received a grant 2 years ago to look at on-farm plastics and also plastic milk bottles, and what could be established as a recovery program for that. There's been a program, the Vinyl Council Australia, where I used to work. They've picked up a program to see whether indeed they could recover flooring, to put flooring back into some kind of product here in Australia. So there are a number of those initiatives already in the pipeline. They're formative, but they're significant. Obviously, probably everyone's aware of the numerous announcements that have been made in Australia and New Zealand, and indeed globally, about phasing out single-use plastics like straws, lightweight bags, cotton buds, with the plastic stem. So there's a lot of those sorts of initiatives, and they will continue to come on, because indeed what we need to do is clean up the system, in a way, if you want to call it that, and really focus on making good quality plastics that can go back into plastics again. So there's certainly a significant move around that. The report that I've been working on, which will be coming out fairly soon for the Australian government, they commissioned that last year, and that's looking at circular product in Australia, how we move forward on electronic goods, building products, textiles and plastics. So it's definitely in line of sight, and some governments have come up with some wild and woolly ideas. It's really important that your industry is on the front foot and thinking, how can you do more and go to government with a really good idea that will be acceptable to you and to them to make a way forward. So the project that I'm working on with the Australian Food and Grocery Council is to have a national scheme for collection of post-consumer soft plastics in the yellow bin in a designated bag. Massive change. You can imagine that we're negotiating with, it's massive. But that's the kind of change that we're seeing in Europe, and that's the kind of change we'll need to see in Australasia as well.
I'm surprised that we decided to demonize plastic and carbon dioxide. 150 or 200, nearly 200 years ago, London was the first city who had a sewer, as we know. And before, until now actually, London and Paris are known that you can have a slippery experience because dogs are everywhere and they're messing. Were the dogs guilty of the mess? No, the behavior. The same is now. It's not the plastic, but how we treat the plastic. If we dump it to the water courses, if we put it in the wrong place, it's not fault of plastic. The same is carbon dioxide. With carbon dioxide is, after all, less than 1% all of gases in the system. And we're blaming this poor carbon dioxide for everything. After all, without carbon dioxide, when we're flying, we can see it a few thousand meters and we got a minus 60 degrees. Carbon dioxide is warming us up and keeping possible. Carbon dioxide is for photosynthesis. But we got a tendency to blame plastic just because we don't know how to handle. Clothes are more polluting than plastic. All sorts of clothes, because plus some are polyester and others. We're using more clothes as a landfill than plastic.
Yep.
So, demonizing one product like a plastic or carbon dioxide, it's so unfair and emotionally charged.
Yeah, very good point. And indeed, I could add that textiles is also on the agenda, which is why I mentioned, I could give a similar presentation on exactly what's happening in the textiles world. This is not just specific to plastics. The same is happening with regard to steel. So for example, Twiggy Forrest is intending to have green steel, all right? The revolution that we're talking about is universal. The revolution we're talking about applies to all kind of production, industrial production systems. It also applies to overconsumption and not circularity. So in the same way that there's this work going on in terms of plastics around the world, and particularly in Europe, is also happening in relation to the built environment. In Europe, for example, and I haven't got slides here, they're moving to now what they call a material passport for buildings. So when buildings are built and constructed, there is like a rule, a how-to book that tells the building owner what was made, where it comes from, what was the composition. And what they're now doing is if they're doing an upgrade of the building, they're keeping the fabric of the building as much as possible and just changing elements within it, i.e. to improve the thermal efficiency of it by changing the windows and going to triple glazing. It's astonishing the way in which there is change going forward. In Europe, and those figures that I gave you of the extraordinary recycling rate in Europe is all kinds of plastics. So that's PVC, that's polyethylenes, that's your PS, your EP, all sorts of polypropylene. It's extraordinary the kind of recovery that they're pursuing there. With regard to things like climate change, I think that it's fairly undeniable that we're all contributing to that, and the way we work within the environment that we're in, we have to make changes in order to reduce the emissions and the factors that we're producing. Good question, thank you. So yes, plastics, and I think one of the reasons why plastic is so much in the firing line, because there is so much concern about marine plastics and litter. And it happens to be part of the same industry. So yes, you're very right, we get lumped in with that. Rainwater tanks, plastic, oh, it's bad, And that's why I say it's so important that you are on the front foot to disassociate yourself from the single-use plastics in order to be seen to be a good corporate citizen, because that scrutiny is there already. Oh, that's a very good question. So the question is about dodginess and greenwashing. I guess in summary, so our life cycle assessments being more rigorous and truthful. Look, there's all kinds of dodginess, and that's why I mentioned the green claims and the fact that the Danes are over it, and the Danish Ombudsman has said, enough, you now need to do an LCA. I haven't looked into, well, I'm assuming that they're probably saying it needs to be a full life cycle assessment, not just a little bit of your LCA. You need to look at the whole of the life cycle of the product, not just this little bit that's going to be in your favour. But yes, green claims are only going to increase. There's no doubt about it, because as there's more scrutiny, there's going to be more interest. And so this goes back to your label. Actually, what is the credibility behind your label? The Vinyl Council, I think where I used to work, I've gone the wrong, it doesn't matter. I've given a link there to you. So the Vinyl Council of Australia has been the first in Australia to produce a certification for recycled content plastic product. They went to a firm called GECA, Good Environmental Choice Australia, I think, GECA. And GECA and Vinyl Council have come up with this certification, which clearly specifies what is recycled content. It's brilliant. It's the first time it's been done. It's available for anyone in that industry to apply. And I think it serves as a good role model for you going forward, for you to have something comparable, Australian-made, which will be relevant to our legislation and frameworks and so forth, that you could adapt for your own circumstances too. Thanks. I wish you all the very best, and I'll be around till morning tea, so I look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation. And I look forward to seeing what you're going to be doing by 2030. So thanks so much.
Everybody, thank you. A good thing, hopefully.
Oh, that'll be very well treated.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helen. Things I took from that, working together, I think there's a lot of work that we can all do, and we've already started doing it. But it's something we're also synonymous for Australians, New Zealanders, the Pacific nations. We are innovators. We're solution providers. So we're being faced with a problem. I'm sorry if you forgot.
I bought a prop and I completely forgot. My apologies, Ian. So I I don't normally buy gizmos, right? I'm not that kind of a person. But anyway, I was fascinated by this. This is actually German made, and it just shows you, one of the things I didn't include up there was that the German government has passed a rule that requires that manufacturers have capacity, a responsibility to take back product at end of life. That doesn't mean that everything will come back to them, but it means that they all of a sudden have gone, we don't want to be responsible for stuff that we can't recycle. It's actually a really nice, elegant law, because automatically the manufacturers have gone, okay, well, if we're going to be now responsible for this at end of life, we're going to make it so it is recyclable. And so what have they done? So rather than specifying something really complicated and difficult as a piece of legislation, so this is now coming into Australia. Every piece of this product, which is detachable, has not only a polymer stamp, it's got a batch stamp on it. It tells me that this is polypropylene, this is polyester, PS, and it tells me when it was made, what batch, and what is it's got 1-to-1 or something like that on it. So I'm presuming that it means that if they go back to their product and this returns to them, they know exactly its composition and they can put it back into product again. I just love it, so elegant, so simple. Anyway, sorry about that.
Just a heads up, we also have a similar certification, a similar certification that we can do embedding on our products, and we do it with different things. Oh God. Anyway, Australians, New Zealanders, we've got a problem. We're innovators. We'll find solutions. Something that I think we're all striking. Those who deal with government, we're all striking the government requirements for greater quantities of recycled material, in our product. So that's something that I think is going to happen. And just something on that, we're talking about different alternative energy sources. We're looking in the near future at a 300 kilowatt solar system. All right, let's not be limited by the government making it hard for 99 kilowatts, etc. If we're going to do this, let's look at going big, at finding some solutions to this.